Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the kickoff to Sustainable Conservation Spring Voices from the Field webinar series. So I'm pleased to welcome you. I'm Josette Lewis, the CEO of Sustainable Conservation, just 3 months into the job of joining this amazing group, and can't be more excited than to talk with our two speakers today. For those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is a nonprofit organization focused exclusively on California and really works collaboratively using stewardship together to address California's land, air, and water for the benefit of both people and nature. Through this webinar series, it's a chance for us and our partners to explore collaborative strategies that strengthen watersheds and mitigate climate risks across California. So I think you'll hear all of that at the highest level, as I'm joined by two of our leaders here in the state of California, Karla Nemeth, who's the director of the Department of Water Resources, and Virginia Jameson, who is the Deputy Secretary for Climate and Working Lands at the California Department of Food and Agriculture. So before we jump in, I want to make sure to thank our sponsors who make this possible. That is Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery, Environmental Science Associates, and Holland and Knight. These sponsors make it possible to bring our vision to you and to share in the work that we do here in California. So with that, we're going to jump right in. So I'll just start off with a really broad question to both Karla and Virginia, and that is, what does climate resilience mean in the context of your work in water and agriculture at the state level? So maybe start with you, Karla, because you're right to me.
You bet. Thanks for having me. And at the interest or at the potential expense of just being sort of a little over the top, I do want to just thank Josette and welcome her into this role. The department has shared one of our most productive external partnerships with sustainable conservation, and I love the theme Voices from the Field, because those of us sitting in Sacramento always don't get enough time in the field, and that is really where we advance our climate readiness in the state. We can say all the things we want in Sacramento, but if it's not working on the ground, it's not working. So I'm just really delighted to be here to talk to you all and talk to my colleague Virginia at CDFA. We also have a very strong partnership because water and agriculture are hand in glove. And so at the department, climate really affects everything that we do. So I think most folks may not be aware that, frankly, the whole Department of Water Resources was actually built around the California Water Plan that focused on the State Water Project. And over time, once that project was built and was fulfilling certain policy goals for California, a lot of it being urban, but an important piece of that being agricultural, particularly in the southern part of the Central Valley, but also providing reliability for growers in the Feather River in particular, which is where our project originates, and then also really backstopping water quality in the Delta, which is also dominated by a lot of important growers there as well. So that's really how the department started. But then, of course, over time, as our population grew and some of the real environmental challenges became very obvious, and Californians moved to protect more of the environment, our responsibilities grew there as well. The department also plays an important role in flood protection for the state, mostly in the Central Valley. We provide a lot of support work, but what that also means is the department is really front and center on forecasting. And maybe a little known fact, I think folks are becoming more and more familiar with Dr. Michael Anderson. He's our state climatologist. But a little known fact is that he actually works for DWR, which is unusual. It's traditionally a position in other states that is housed in an academic institution. And when I first became DWR director, which was in 2018, we had some really starting to get into that weather whiplash. And I said, who's our state climatologist and where does he live in our organization? And I was stunned to find that Dr. Anderson was fairly quite a few layers deep in a pretty big bureaucracy, and he was attached to our flood operations because so much of forecasting is about public safety. He now works directly for the director of DWR and certainly has a much broader purview. And that to me is just very reflective of our climate reality, how focusing on our changing hydrologic conditions, our changing precipitation patterns really fits not only with our planning function, but also our operational function. And so now we are working across not just the State Water Project, frankly, that got a lot started for the department, but our groundwater management responsibilities and how those fit with better flood protection responsibilities, how we incentivize local water agencies to plan at a watershed scale, for example, and the importance of water use efficiency. So all of these things fit together. And I think for us, it has been an enormous institutional challenge for us to kind of take a step back and say, how do we integrate across our responsibilities, especially since we're asking so much of our working landscapes, our irrigation districts, our water agencies to also step into that integration space. And 100% of it is focused on our changing hydrology, what it means for water availability in California, and how we adapt to that changing hydrology in a way that incorporates water supply stability, but also important environmental protections and a real human right to water and access to water for everybody.
Great. Thanks for that, Karla. Turning to you, Virginia, just this week, I believe you guys just issued a new report on climate resilience from the Department of Agriculture. So maybe turning to you what that means in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also would like to thank you and Sustainable Conservation both for the opportunity to be here and for your ongoing partnership. We've had such an amazing relationship with Sustainable Conservation, and you guys have provided, critical, practical feedback and input for things like our manure recycling innovative products task force, and then also more recently your work on cover cropping in the Sigma era has just been super critical, especially for this topic we're talking about today. And so, yeah, for us at CDFA, where our mission is to safeguard a resilient food system and cultivate a California grown food supply that's globally recognized for, one of the things being sustainability. Climate resilience really means ensuring that our agricultural system, which includes our farms, our farmers, our supply chains, can absorb shocks and continue to function under increasing pressures. So whether that means prolonged drought, and we've seen historic recent prolonged droughts, atmospheric rivers, which we've also seen recently, where a ton of water arrives all at once, or just heat events that stress crops and workers, the slow creep of salinization. Resilience for me and for us is really about adaptive capacity, which I think we have to think about in a really broad sense. It means ensuring that farmers have the tools, the information, and also the financial runway to make decisions that are going to keep them viable across a 20 or 30-year time horizon, not just the next growing season. So yeah, thank you for bringing up our climate resilience strategy for California agriculture. We just released it last week. We're really excited. It's a very broad approach, and we worked with the whole of the state government to really outline the many things that the state is doing to protect resilience in agriculture. And it spans, regional food systems, energy, dairy sustainability, ranching, but also has a chapter specifically dedicated to water. So I'm going to put those links in the chat so that folks can see them too. But yeah, so really broad meaning for us here at CDFA.
Rookie mistake there. I'm talking while I was muted. I'm always quick to remind people just how diverse and world-class the agriculture is in this state. And we're one of the top 10 agricultural economies in the world, in addition to being one of the top economies generally. So it's really, as you say, resilience is a it has to have a lot of broad meaning to adapt to all the different kinds of agriculture that we have to both feed Californians and US and the world with some of the most nutritious products. Maybe getting into a little bit more detail now, if you could each talk about what are some of the tools that you're really drilling in on to think about climate resilience. Karla, you mentioned just among the things you might talk about, you mentioned the really taking this watershed scale, which really cuts across a lot of units of management, both state, federal, and local. And I know you have some really important work that we did with you that was just released last year in terms of watershed studies. But maybe whether it's that or other tools, talk a little bit about some specific things that you're working towards that you think will take us to that next level of integrating climate into what is already a challenging water situation, as we all know.
Yeah, well, that's a really good one. So, and like all good things, there's a lot of few people who toiled in relative obscurity before all of this came together. And so, what Josette is referring to are watershed studies that the department began several years ago. Actually, I think it was 2018, and it includes major tributaries in the Central Valley, so the Tuolumne, the Merced, the Stanislaus, the Upper San Joaquin, the Calaveras, places where, which was interesting for the department, of course, because that's not State Water Project. It's not our sort of traditional State Water Project sort of territory, if you will. But we were very interested in this kind of integrated planning that could happen in those watersheds. And we essentially took a look at in the upper watershed, what are all the risks and how is climate expressing itself as a risk? And if we looked at something called forecast-informed reservoir operations, meaning our ability to refine the timing and magnitude and geographic location of incoming atmospheric rivers, can we operate our reservoirs better in a way that both preserves public safety and protects public safety, but also gives us enough time to actually do something with those flood releases. And a bit of that was prompted by the intensity of the overdraft situation essentially in those watersheds. And so we put out what we've called watershed studies. And what they do is they start to take a look at, they sort of marry this forecast-informed reservoir operations with other work that the department had done doing this aerial electromagnetic imaging of where do we have the right kind of soils for recharge? Where are the biggest opportunities to do that? Where is the need the greatest? And that's where, with the GRAT tool, the sustainable conservation folks are really, really critical, especially in our early studies, to do that work with local landowners and really, really reflect their knowledge about what it takes working on the ground, which wasn't a knowledge that the department had per se. And you might be shocked to know that DWR knocks on your door. People don't fling it wide open all the time. And so sustainable conservation coming in and really helping us with those relationships and helping. One of the great things is when we get together, like with SUSCON or Scripps, and we say, come into the room with us when we're trying to really manage, then we know how to focus our efforts on things that are actually meaningful on the ground, meaning there's a lot of, we call it gee whiz research, which is really cool, but is it really helping? Is it really getting us towards solutions? And that's what we were able to do with sustainable conservation on these watershed studies. And so what they're showing is pretty interesting, is that if we do this forecast informed reservoir operations, there is more water available for groundwater recharge. And that's going to be important for the long-term health of the valley and the long-term health of agriculture. And but it's also showing a couple of things. One, it's showing that surprising no one, it's not going to come in this attenuated way that lots of water managers are used to. We are trying strenuously to transition from these long-term averages and designing our project feasibility around these and funding around these long-term averages to something that can more fully embrace the reality of extremes. And so what it means is that the opportunities that are there are going to require multiple benefits. They're going to require partnerships between not just the Corps of Engineers, which is, the operator of these reservoirs, but irrigation districts, flood agencies, groundwater managers, agricultural community where we're doing groundwater recharge, to pull all of these pieces together. Certainly NGOs, because there's a lot of co-benefits that we see around in-stream conditions and groundwater conditions. And that's one of the really curious things about this study too, is it's finally starting to show, based on the data, that when we invest in groundwater recharge, in sort of times of plenty, if you will, when we have drought, that supported groundwater system actually helps support our river systems, meaning less of that water that's released down the river actually seeps into the ground because it's not just percolating, quickly. And that to me was also something that was really important to be able to have all the data to point out, right? And so those studies are hugely important because of the quality of the information and the sophistication in which the data has been put together, and it prevents challenges and opportunities. And eventually, one of the things we're really looking forward to is, okay, so we know there are things we can do. So it's really about us as people working together with clarity, with transparency about what these trade-offs are, about how we get these things financed. And from my perspective, everything is funneling to these kind of multi-benefit opportunities, because we do have an affordability with water infrastructure in California. We have a significant affordability problem. So it's really ideal to create these multi-benefit kinds of programs. And then maybe the last thing, Josette, about this study that I think is really interesting is there's 5 tributaries, and it really also matters what we're doing across all tributaries, because groundwater banks, they don't match our surface water, right? So you can be recharging in the next watershed over, and once it gets underground, that water is moving into a different part of the groundwater basin. That's also a wake-up call for folks about things need to be very local, but they also need to be regional. So we're really excited about those and some opportunities potentially with Prop 4 to fund some pilot projects. We also have other, in other parts of the state, places like Ventura or Sonoma, people who are, I think, had more local resources dedicated to this watershed scale kind of strategy. They've also been doing some work with some grant funding from the department to, okay, we're ready to go. What are these projects like? So that's that's also going to be kind of a proving ground. And then all of it really gets wrapped up into our revised California water plan, which I think folks are have an increased awareness that there's more of a focus on watershed scale and what are we doing, what's the reality in adapting to climate. So those three things, big and small, regional, local, and then statewide, all kind of working together.
Right. Yeah. And I just underscore both the challenge and the opportunity that you need all those actors kind of being willing to go in the same direction to get to the promise and the opportunity that studies suggest, which is, a lot more water going into recharge opportunities, a lot more ecosystem benefits for the surface water systems. I mean, again, you think about droughts or when stream flows are most at risk, and the fact that groundwater recharge could be a resilience mechanism for those ecosystems and the fish that we care and are working so hard to bring back. It's that getting those different units to work collaboratively, and we have seen some really positive opportunities in some of our work working with irrigation districts, GSAs. And so hopefully we'll be part of some pilots to help implement those studies and what it promises. So turning to you, Virginia, we also really think of the scale of the farm and the role that they can play in resilience. And I don't know if you would like to talk a little bit about some of those practices that CDFA has really been an important partner in bringing some incentives to farmers and ranchers that we didn't always have, and really kind of showing what's possible and de-risking that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the farm scale is where we specialize at CDFA. And so for this conversation, I'm really, happy to focus on the link between water and soil health or soil quality. This week, for those of you who don't know, we're celebrating CDFA's Healthy Soils Week. And that's important for so many reasons, but one of the big reasons is that healthy soil holds water. We know that a 1% increase in soil organic matter can hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water per acre. So that is a really big deal. So we know that when we invest in soil health, we're also building drought resilience and reducing the need for irrigation. So we really can't separate soil health from the overall water picture. So for us, building soil health at the farm scale really means talking about practices like cover cropping, compost application, installing things like hedgerows, reducing tillage. These practices all can improve water infiltration, reduce runoff, build organic matter. And we have a couple different, we've had a few different ones, but one of our flagship programs over the years has been our Healthy Soils program. And we're, I think, almost at 10 years of administering this program. So that program funds all those practices that I just talked about, plus many others. I think there's 28 different practices you can apply for. And so I'm really excited because that program has new funding coming to it through Proposition 4, the climate bond. We've got $65 million, and we'll be administering that through block grants. So local and regional organizations can apply for the money and then work with farmers locally to help implement those practices. And that's really great because it brings the technical assistance component of the program closer to home, and really helps those local organizations work with farmers on the issues that are affecting them in their area. I also stuck a link to our climate bond funding programs in the chat. I also want to give a shout out to our state water efficiency and enhancement program. That program also has some climate bond funding. And SWEEP, as we call it, is really focused on improvements to irrigation efficiency. So you may be switching from like a flood irrigation to a drip irrigation. It also has a focus, of course, on greenhouse gas reductions because it's been funded by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in the past. And so that includes things like switching from diesel pumps to kind of solar energy run pumps, and that one will also be administered as block grants. And GSAs and irrigation districts are eligible applicants, so we're really excited to, hopefully, again, like with the Healthy Soils program, see some regional impacts from giving out these larger block grants. And I can't remember if I said that one has 40 million bucks. So I did want to say, and like Karla is clearly an expert on the state and regional level stuff, but a program that's been really important that CDFA has participated in, I'm on the Interagency Advisory Committee for, is the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Program that's run through the Department of Conservation. And that program is, similarly enabling regional governments and organizations to look at the landscape in their area and help the community, kind of have a conversation with itself about what do we want this area to look like? How can we support transitions in land use where we need it? But how can we also, keep agriculture where it's appropriate, or look at other ways of using the land for community benefit while avoiding things like, dust bowl conditions where our topsoil blows away, or where we just have fields covered in pests and weeds because they're fallowed without being put to a different use. So that's been another really important program out of the state.
Yeah, and maybe I'll circle back in a minute to you, Karla, on multi-benefit land repurposing, but I did want to just drill a little bit in on some interesting connection between soil health practices and water, and that is this report that Sustainable Conservation put out last year on cover crops in the era of SGMA. I worked, as some folks know, I worked for the almond industry for a number of years before coming to Sustainable Conservation. We leaned very hard on cover crops and soil health practices. We had rapid adoption of cover crops by growers. There were some market benefits to it as buyers were interested in regenerative practices. And so we were all going in the right direction, great programs from CDFA, a lot of other nonprofits helping out. And then Sustainable Conservation helped us all realize that the way groundwater sustainability agencies, these kind of regional units, do their water consumption calculations, the tools they're using could disincentivize cover crops. So a little bit of a policy disconnect there, or misalignment. Still work to be done to that, but I think that does point to, Karla, a point you made earlier, which is, we're still figuring out how to connect the dots, and there's going to be maybe some stumbles along the way that we have to just kind of learn from quickly in order to get to this vision of climate resilience. And there's some science that we'll learn along the way as well, and have to make some adjustments. So that's an area we're still very, very involved in, that connects between SGMA as a DWR-led regulation and what's happening on the farms. But I'm pretty confident we can overcome that. So Karla, maybe you would like to talk about multi-benefit land repurposing and some of the other ways that that DWR is part of this equation of thinking about this intersection of different water users, and in this case, the particularly significant footprint that agriculture has in the Central Valley.
Yeah, so this is that was a terrific segue into this conversation. So, to me, this is just sort of a moment where sort of everything is moving all at once, and so we have spent the last 10 years, I think, yes, I really cannot overstate the intensity of accomplishment in groundwater management that SGMA triggered. And some of it's super basic, like just knowing what's happening, because now we have to measure it. And the amount of energy that it took these communities to establish, their actual jurisdictions, right? And DWR was doing a lot of work on on really modeling and defining what the actual physical, basin and sub-basin boundaries are. Like how are we managing this piece? And so that has essentially sort of created this kind of container, if you will, around starting to kind of organize ourselves around, what will the outcome be with groundwater management. And the reality of groundwater management is there's two realities. One is by 2040, for the ag that's in the valley, their water supply will be more reliable than it is today, and more reliable than it was when groundwater management passed. The other reality is that there's not a single legislator from the Central Valley that voted for SGMA. Because of the intensity of the transition and the unknown. And there's a lot that happens between those two, 2015 and 2040. And we're really sort of, I think we're sort of towards the end of this overarching, here's the governance structure, here's the assessment, here's what we understand around soils, and here's what we're starting to understand around forecasting. And so now what do we do with all this information? What's also been happening in parallel is this, this sense that we knew there was going to be transitions happening in these local economies. And so that work has been underway. We have a sister department, the Department of Conservation, that has really been spearheading that kind of work. And so DWR participates in that relative to all the tools that I was just describing about what really is available and how should we be thinking about this and how does it fit? What do we know essentially needs to transition, needs to come out of production because there will be a contraction. And so some of the places, obviously it's really the white spaces, the spaces that were not connected to surface water supplies. And surface water supplies in places like the Westlands Irrigation District, where, they are sort of more junior on the Central Valley project system. And so they were really out in front in some of this solar transition. They're doing everything. They're doing a lot of groundwater recharge, but they're also doing a lot of large scale land transitioning. And so the department has been involved in helping them with that. There's a lot of synergies, if you will, between, we're a big energy user. We also are an energy producer, but we also have to transition our own system, our own state water project system, to entirely renewable by 2035, which is 10 years sooner than the rest of the state. I'll just leave that there. That's an intense frustration for some of our state water contractors. And
I've heard that the state, about a third of the electricity used in the state is to move water. So not all in your hand, but some in your hand and then some in the irrigation, right? It's
exactly
a lot of energy.
So this kind of investments in renewables is really important, and proximity to our aqueducts is also important. And so we've been working on that. The other thing that we've done, which I think of as a sort of a complement to the larger scale work that our Department of Conservation is leading, is something called Land Flex. And that was a program that was born out of the Newsom drought. I don't think our governor appreciates that, but I did a brown drought and a Newsom drought. So this is part of the Newsom drought.
You get to own it when you're governor,
right?
Huh?
Right. And admittedly in a period where we were a little more flush with our budget. But this was a moment where in the drought situation, the state, we're really trying to get out of like massive emergency response when we have droughts. We'll always have a degree of that because development is uneven in terms of vulnerability. But what we wanted to do was, the state traditionally comes in when wells dry up, and we come in and we bring in tanks of water, and sometimes those communities, it takes them years and years to get off of that. And we thought, well, now that we have groundwater management, what if we tried a different strategy? And we worked with the Almond Board and United Dairies to really talk about, is there a way that we could incentivize growers to temporarily fallow, to be compensated for fallowing, and do it in a way that also fit with their overall Sigma requirements to reduce overdraft, but give them, and when I say temporary, meaning giving them maximum flexibility about where to do the fallowing so that it fits with other things that they were working on and other kinds of rotations that they were in, whether with cover crops or otherwise. And the idea was we were focusing that program on areas where the state knew that we had real vulnerabilities with domestic wells. And that's really, for lack of a better phrasing, how we kind of made the pitch was like, we can either spend money dragging these big tanks in, or we can actually incentivize growers not to grow, relieve pressure on that domestic well, and have it also contribute more broadly over the long term to the sustainability of that groundwater basin. And it was focused on smaller farmers, which I think was really helpful. And I think I point that out because I think it's going to take everything. And I think there's real wisdom in providing the bigger architecture and providing sort of the data and information in a transparent way to let us lead with that. Versus kind of coming in with like, here are all these programs, right? Like the cover crop issue. We're really gonna learn. So we need to provide that sort of overall architecture, understand a little bit the art of the possible, and then really start working on these smaller scale, more incremental ideas that we can test. And Landflex actually really ended up saving, I want to say, in the neighborhood of 100,000 acres of acre feet of water. I mean, it was not insignificant. And so while I think that program is probably on life support given the state of our budget, but I don't want to lose what we learned in that, because it was also in my mind important because it made the idea of fallowing less reactive, the idea of being paid to fallow less reactive. Like, when we first wandered into that, everyone, didn't matter which, oh, no. But really it was working with folks to say, how can we shape this? We know there's something to do. We know there's this long-term benefit to the groundwater. We know there's sort of stacks, if you will, of incentives, right? Because individual GSAs have money to incentivize, and then the state's coming in to incentivize. And then sometimes, with CDFA was our partner in all of that. What kind of funding do they have? And it's really bringing all of those pieces. Maybe it's another way, Josette, of thinking about, there's multi-benefits to everything.
Right.
And we need climate is such an overarching imperative. We need to kind of leave the whole, beneficiary pays for the things that they get, and start defining a broader public interest in sort of how we all contribute. And I think that was one of the important things about that program. And it also shows that, we can actually be flexible and responsive and have things that are a little bit more landowner driven.
Right. Yeah, no, I really would double down on that example of Landflex, which I think of as an incentive to temporary fallow land. Don't replant your orchard or your crop for a period of time to save literal amounts of water during a drought, or as we get into Sigma. Couple things that I think were really interesting about it that you touched upon were the benefit not only to the grower at a time when they might have had really high water prices, if you're talking about a drought, but also to the communities. I live in a part of the state where my municipal drinking water comes from well water. lot of rural households get their drinking water that way. And we know that that is a significant challenge. And so the less water farmers are using, that you can accomplish a benefit to the community as well. And then one other interesting piece, and you kind of touched upon that, Virginia, too, is as we look at land transition, and in this case, even just temporary fallowing of land, we've learned that just letting it go, not cultivating it, is a problem. That dust is a huge public health problem in the Central Valley that already suffers in the San Joaquin from poor air quality, just because of their geography and lots of things going on in that region. And by requiring a cover crop during land flex, that fallowing, they were able to reduce the dust. So the cover crop had a benefit to public health in that case, in addition to keeping the topsoil and not having those dust bowl conditions for growers. So you'll be glad to know, Karla, we're very big fans of it, and we're hoping to maybe use some corporate funding to challenge some DSAs to co-fund a land flex type fallowing, and maybe there'll be opportunities to pair that with cover crop incentives. And as you say, kind of stack and move a few dials simultaneously to get to continue to make progress in a way that doesn't sort of pull the rug out of those communities that have been dependent on agriculture. Both of you have touched a little bit on how you work across agencies and align strategies or policies, because these are really big problems and they cut across. I don't know if each of you would like to give a little bit more color to what that looks like and how that is helping us make some progress on these big problems.
Sure, and maybe I can start with some of the things that we are participating in with DWR. But I'll just say, we spend a lot of our time on interagency coordination. I would say it's more than half of my job probably is just my role communicating with other agencies. We have regular monthly meetings with colleagues at DWR. For example, there's, today is a coordination meeting that happens between our staff at the staff level to just share program updates and make sure we're aware of each other's work. DWR also administers the Drought Resilience Interagency Program, and I'm a member of that. And so we're communicating about all kinds of issues related to drought and drought preparedness. And I would say, every time I learn, I'm in a meeting with folks in our water agencies, I learn so much about what's happening, and their work is so highly specialized and technical. And I would say it is on our side, on the agricultural side too. And so it is a challenge to communicate all the nuance that's happening with the frequency that's required to keep us all on the same page. And so it really is something that we spend a lot of time on. So yeah, those were a couple examples I was thinking about. We're also going to be participating in the California Water Plan update, and all of these various efforts. So Karla probably knows even more about all of them that are happening.
And Karla, your example can be with CDFA or another agency.
Yeah. No, that's a really good start.
There. Yeah.
One of the things the department works on is agriculture water management plans. So we do that for urbans, but we also do it for farms. And always when we're in a drought, everyone likes to look at ag and say, well, what are they doing? And so those plans are a big part of how we interact with CDFA, and like, what is the game plan when we really do get into these challenging situations, which for me is important because so much of what we do is with the irrigation districts, and I've definitely learned that irrigation districts and landowners are not the same thing. And so it's really helpful to have that more immediate interface. I think one of our most prominent interagency efforts right now, there's really two. One is something called Healthy Rivers and Landscapes with the Water Board, which is an alternative approach to an updated water quality control plan, which is both under state and federal law. It's over in the Water Board. And that is where we have been proposing a combination of environmental flows plus landscape scale habitat restoration to help support really fish and wildlife species in the broad Sacramento and San Joaquin Bay Delta watershed, which is critical because it brings water users from San Francisco and Oakland and Silicon Valley and Los Angeles, and everybody's at the table. So you can imagine it's a big, interesting table because everyone has their own views about, how the system ought to be working. But that's one thing that we're working with the Water Board on that we are hopeful will be completed by the fall of this year, and then we will be ready to implement. And so there's real opportunity there. There's a lot of state dollars for habitat restoration and some of this floodplain work that needs to happen, where again we have a lot of co-benefits. But I think even more front and center is the work that we need to do on groundwater recharge and how do we do it more quickly right now. And it was really there's nothing like the reality to give us a gift of like, oh, this is why this is important. I am not exaggerating to say pretty much every time we have a significant storm, I get a call from the governor's office saying, how much of this are we putting into the ground and why isn't it more? And so 2023 was a huge opportunity for that. And what's really fascinating about that, just from a little g government perspective, is because particularly down in Tulare, we don't do flood protection in the same way. They're not part of the state plan of flood control. But we actually knew a lot of those groundwater managers, and that was our inroads on the ground, just phoning them up and saying, what's going on? Like, you got this water coming? Are you talking to your flood agencies? What's the opportunity? And in that sense, we ended up, part of our flood response was a lot of this emergency kind of rip and chip was what we called it, to, take out orchards that were already scheduled to be removed and do it quickly, and especially in areas where there was opportunities for recharge. And 2023 was just a huge moment for us to really understand that, precipitation will come. It's going to come more as rain, and we're not ready for it. And so what does it mean to recharge groundwater at scale? And not surprisingly, it has a pretty big ripple effect across a lot of different water users. And so again, I think one of the questions that I get from the Water Board and got from the Water Board about these watershed studies was, well, gee whiz, you want to do this recharge. It would sure be helpful if on the front end you did a lot of work to have them address multiple benefits, because that really simplifies the board's process to get through approval of that groundwater permit. When they don't have, they will always have protestants to those water rights, but when it's not, everybody, it helps them move through their work more quickly. And it's maybe not quite a sexy thing, if you will, but it's an important thing. And it just really does speak to the importance of we can help ourselves if we work together to understand what's happening when we want to recharge at scale, and the importance of working within the community and including within other water users, which leads me to my next point, which is it really needs to be a system-wide approach. And, even though there's legacy projects or projects that feel like legacy projects, I don't view them as legacy projects. I feel them as future projects like Delta Conveyance, making that system work better. That's really important to a lot of water users that actually rely on our inability to recharge groundwater, right? Because The State Water Project operates off of what we call unregulated flows, or, flows in the system when our system gets really, really big. It's coming through and it's more than other people divert or have a right to divert. Some of them do have a right to divert it. And so how we unpack all of that, who has a right to divert more when we have these big events, as a practical matter, that's something that the State Water Project actually counts on. And so our ability to stabilize the State Water Project in other ways, dealing with subsided aqueducts, dealing with, just the fact that we are opening up our spillways and releasing floods at moments we're turning down our ability to divert. All of these pieces actually do need to fit together for us to be successful. So not a surprise to you, Josette, or anybody probably on this call. I'm very much in favor of really thinking through, a big systemic approach to multiple investments that can help stabilize our system. And the catch to all of that is all of those projects aren't going to be exactly like an individual proponent wants them to be. But we really have to get into a conversation about trade-offs. And we have to get into a conversation about trade-offs that also elevates the historic importance of the environment and communities that don't have access to clean drinking water. And we can do that, and we should do that. But I think groundwater, again, our need to recharge at scale. We have 10 to 12 times our current reservoir capacity in our underground aquifers. They behave differently. It takes longer to fill them, and it takes longer to extract from them. They're not the same as reservoirs, but there's a lot of opportunity there for us to manage things at scale. But we won't be successful unless we're really able to have a serious conversation about, if you pull from here, it takes from there. Well, what does it mean to be climate resilient over there?
Yeah, I guess you said earlier, the prize for all of us, if we're willing to make some trade-offs, is more predictability into the future, because otherwise there'll be a fight for who's the winners and losers, and maybe there'll be less predictability for everybody in that scenario. But I'm sure, well, yeah, some hard work to be done. But I would just echo something I think you said earlier as well, is that it's somewhat amazing how far we've come in the relatively short time that Sigma has been in place. I mean, there is a lot of change, and I hear from lots of actors in the system, including farmers, that, Sigma is going to give them more predictability. Yes, there's going to be some pain, but if they're farming for the long haul, that predictability is important to them too. Well, I'll take a few questions from the audience we have here. Let's see. To read them quickly. Could you talk a little bit, this may be a question to you, Karla, about the intersection between flood-mar and winter flows under the environmental flows framework? Do you see that? Is there challenges that need to be resolved, conflicts between flood-mar and environmental flows framework? This is not my area of expertise, so I can't help you too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truing up that needs to be done. And I think that, when I was mentioning a pretty fascinating interaction between actually supporting our groundwater basins and in-stream flows, which is, it's not there's an added benefit to in-stream flows, especially when things dry out, if you have a groundwater basin that's healthy. So how we manifest that kind of information to enable those programs to talk to each other, I think is we're going to have to do more work on that.
Yeah. Here's another question. You had talked about some technology that's used to determine the areas that are suitable for groundwater recharge. I know you mentioned GRAT, the groundwater recharge assessment tool that was developed by Sustainable Conservation, and we're very excited that DWR is going to invest in making an open source version of that, so that we can transfer that to a lot of users, not just in our hands. Is there other technology that DWR is using to assess groundwater basin size and recharge capacity. I think you use some aerial radar
Right.
technology, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah, so that technology was definitely not new. It was new to us because it took us a while to manage our groundwater basins compared to other states. But that technology was really about, it's kind of like an MRI for the earth, that you sort of measure the resistance, and then you can articulate sort of soil compositions based on that resistance about 1,000 feet down. And so that mapping is done. And it doesn't tell the whole story, but it also helps us kind of triangulate, if you will, like with groundwater monitoring wells, for example, like where to put them, because that's a big part of
Right.
the need, not just from a water level perspective, but also a water quality perspective. So I think all of the tools need to work together. The AEM information needs to work together with the GROT, and the actual data that is coming out of these monitoring wells. And what's also terrific is it used to be that DWR would release a 1,000-page tome every 5 years about the state of groundwater. We don't have to do that anymore. The tome has to come out every 10 years, but what has taken its place is a spring and fall groundwater, which matches the water year. Like, what's the state of our groundwater in the spring? What's the state of our groundwater in the fall? That's our Bulletin 118. So it's a simplified version. But then we have something called California Groundwater Live. You can go in, put in your zip code, and you can find out the data that we have in your neighborhood about the state of your groundwater. And we're adding to that all the time as the plans get further developed and additional monitoring wells go in. It's just a really important place. So when in our next drought, and who knows if we're on the cusp of it, people can get on there and you can watch really what's happening in your system. And that's extraordinary for California.
Great. I'll just ask one last question because I think this is an important one, and one that the administration has really leaned in on, and that is the intersection with tribal organizations, tribal knowledge as it comes to water or farming systems. I was at a meeting just a couple of days ago where someone was talking about more expansive understanding of agriculture that tribal organizations and cultures have had in our state. That's not just kind of the way we think of crops now. But maybe if either one of you wants to just touch upon that, and then we'll come to an end.
I can jump in a little bit. We have started integrating cultural burning into the Healthy Soils program. So you'll see that as an available practice this year. And I think we really are trying to move from this, I see in the question in the chat, this compulsory consultation, to really integrating tribes and their local knowledge into our work. One tension I want to acknowledge is that as we all start to do this as state agencies, we are sort of overwhelming the tribes with requests. And so I want to also point to work that's happening at both CNRA and the Strategic Growth Council to do tribal capacity building, because that's very important too. We're asking folks who are pretty under-resourced themselves to contribute to a massive suite of projects and policies. So it's important that we continue those investments in their capacity building as well.
Great. Karla, I know I'm running the risk of going over for a minute here, but if you want to weigh in on this, obviously an important issue around access.
Yeah, for certain. So a lot of the work that we're doing on habitat restoration, and particularly salmon, what do salmon need, requires a lot of interaction with tribes, particularly up on the McCloud, and challenges with winter run, and the ideas of getting fish back to their natal streams, which is expensive and challenging, but important as temperatures rise on the valley floor. So that's certainly front and center. But beyond that, our California water plan, the one we are now updating, for the first time ever, we had a tribal ecological knowledge, a whole chapter, and we essentially turned that over to the tribes and had them use their voice in how to put together their relationship with California's water resources and what needs to be done in climate readiness. So we're looking forward to more of that as we do the next version of the water plan.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both. This was just a wonderful discussion. I actually learned a lot during it. So thank you so much for making the time. We had great participation online. Just to close up, to our audience, yes, we will post this webinar recording on our website. Please join us for the next webinar on May 6th, which will focus on groundwater recharge and multi-benefit land repurposing. So you can hear a little bit more from us on that topic. And really encourage all of you, if you're able to consider making a donation. 50% of the budget for this organization, which you guys were very generous, Karla and Virginia, talking about the work we do, comes from individual donors. So you can play an important role in helping achieve some of the visions for climate resilience that you heard today. And thank you again so much for joining us, and hope to see you on May 6th for our next webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great day.